Gotcha. Good day and welcome. Thank you for joining me for this educational forum titled Caneel for the People, Reimagining Public Spaces. We trust that this will be an enlightening and enriching conversation regarding the current closure and future direction of the Caneel Bay area located inside the Virgin Islands National Park in St. John, United States Virgin Islands. This educational program is organized by St.JanCo, the St. John Heritage Collective, with support from the Friends of the Virgin Islands National Park. We remain grateful to WTJX for its ongoing support. I will serve as your host for today's discussion. I am Dr. Hadia Soar, President and co-founder of St.JanCo, and a research affiliate in the African and African American Studies program at Stanford University. I, like many of my fellow St. Johnians and longtime residents of St. John, remain deeply concerned about our future. As a community, we have many pressing questions and poignant opinions regarding the possible pathways forward at Caneel. Therefore, it's a privilege to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you about how we as a community can learn more about the history of Caneel Bay and the current planning for redevelopment. The future of Caneel Bay is currently undecided. The long-term closure of a hotel that was once the largest employer on St. John and a cornerstone in the Virgin Islands economy raises important questions about power, economic justice, disaster recovery, and the future of development on St. John and the wider US Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands National Park Service is currently planning for the redevelopment of the Caneel Bay area. And today, we will be joined by panelists who will help to illuminate key aspects of the history, planning, redevelopment, and cultural significance of the Caneel Bay site. We will begin this segment with a brief history of the Caneel Bay area. But first, I'd like to welcome our guests to the panel. We are joined by Superintendent of the Virgin Islands National Park, Nigel Fields, who will tell us a little about his work with the Virgin Islands National Park.
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sewer.
Good day, Superintendent Fields. We are also joined by the Commercial Services Program Manager, Ms. Elba Richardson.
Good afternoon, sir, and the other panelists.
Good day, Ms. Richardson. Also joining the show, our filmmaker and anthropologist, Dr. Crystal Fortwrangler.
Hello, thank you so much for having me join today. It's nice to see everyone and be here. Thanks.
Good to see you also. We are also joined by Senator Stephen Payne.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sewer and fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to a robust conversation into Caneel Bay this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity.
Good afternoon. And as they will help us to contextualize the history of the Virgin Islands National Park and the Caneel Bay Resort, we are also deeply excited to be joined by architect and St.JanCo Vice President and co-founder, Mr. Kirsch March Jr.
Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Glad to be here and talking about space, especially space on St. John. Looking forward to a lively conversation.
Thank you. And we are excited to have Mr. Edmund Roberts, a St. Jonian elder who spent decades working for the National Park Service with positions in Alaska, San Diego, California, and of course, St. John with us as well. Good day.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm quite happy to be here, and hopefully I can answer some of the questions that pops up and give you a good idea of my experiences here in the Virgin Islands National Park.
Thank you. We are happy to have you here as well. The Caneel Bay Resort is such a significant location. It is the site of acts of resistance, and it also holds many indigenous pre-Columbian artifacts and remnants of the European colonial era. Mr. Roberts and Mr. March will talk a bit about what Caneel means to them and to the people of St. John, with an eye towards how we might think about space, reclaim our island, and develop our significant sites in ways that maximize Virgin Islanders' access to the property and its resources. In many ways, I'm incredibly excited about this conversation. I trust that it will be generative. I'm grateful to each of our panelists, as well as our viewers, for taking the time to engage in this important dialogue. The Caneel Bay area is located inside the Virgin Islands National Park, which was founded in August of 1956 through congressional legislation and the philanthropic efforts of Lawrence Rockefeller and the Jackson Hole Preserve, a nonprofit conservation organization founded by Rockefeller. The park currently occupies over 2/3 of St. John, and the people of the Virgin Islands, and St. John especially, have a complicated relationship with the Virgin Islands National Park. The park is widely regarded as a pristine gem, a beacon for nature tourism, and a catalyst of St. John's luxury real estate market. Yet, the ancestral people of St. John often critique the park on several fronts, many of which we will discuss in this segment. After the devastating 2017 hurricanes, the Caneel Bay Resort remained shuttered as its owner, Gary Engel of CBI Acquisitions, sought to renew his retained use estate agreement. The park and federal government opted not to renew Engel's RUE, and we find ourselves now planning for the redevelopment at Caneel. But there are many outstanding questions. What options are available to the community of St. John? What is the plan for redevelopment? And how can Virgin Islanders and all of the stakeholders in our community be engaged in meaningful ways throughout the redevelopment process? Currently, members of the community have voiced concerns that while the federal government has sought input from Virgin Islanders, it could do more to meaningfully engage the most marginalized members of the community, namely those who may not have access to virtual meeting platforms or the time and expertise needed to read some of the planning documents. The site is important in part because Caneel was formerly known and operated as the Caneel Bay Plantation, and therefore it also raises pertinent questions about who should benefit from the remnants of the plantation system and whose voices will be heard in the redevelopment planning process. We are going to open the phone lines a little later on in the program, and if you want to weigh in, please call in at 340-718-3339. Again, 340-718-3339. You will have the opportunity to pose questions to each of our presenters and guests. I am grateful to each of our panelists for taking the time to shed some light on what's going on at Caneel. And to begin, I'd like to welcome Superintendent Nigel Fields and Ms. Elba Richardson. To begin, Superintendent Fields, can you tell us a bit about your professional trajectory and your work as superintendent of the Virgin Islands National Park? Specifically, can you help us to understand what the superintendent does and what excites you most about your work with the Virgin Islands National Park?
Thank you, Dr. Sewer, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to St.JanCo for this opportunity, WTJX Fantastic to be here again. An honor to share the time with this panel. And as was said earlier, I'm looking forward to a really generative discussion. Once again, I'm Nigel Fields, Superintendent here at Virgin Islands National Park. I arrived here about 3.5 years ago. And before coming to the Virgin Islands, I had assignments within management at Great Smoky Mountains National Park and also in New Orleans at Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, and also New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. And that area is my home base, and it's a place that is very close to me. And the idea of Caribbean culture, North Caribbean culture, and being able to share it and being able to find ways to engage people in it was something that I bring to my experience here. And also, there was a lot of efforts after Hurricane Katrina with rebuilding all sorts of infrastructure needs within the city of New Orleans after, including education. And I participated in several ways with that. So I feel that some of the things that we're working on here on St. John after the hurricanes are very directly relevant to some of the work that I've done previously. And it is, I think, important to reference that I also spent 15 years at the Environmental Protection Agency. My background is environmental health. So some of the challenges that we're finding right now as we look at some environmental contaminants that need to be cleaned up on the site at Caneel. I have some reference to how we go about doing those types of cleanups, how we engage communities in the process, and making sure that we are being mindful of some of the environmental justice needs of the community. So there's a range of experiences that I bring here, but also it's been fantastic to engage with the local community on the long history here of the park and the need for a lot more engagement. And so that's one of the exciting things that I find about the job is to find ways to have those conversations, to bring people back into the space, to make sure it's clear that all this belongs to all of us. We all have to find ways to share this space. And Caneel gives us a really unique opportunity to honor a history, but also shape a future going forward. So that's one of the things that really excites me about the job that I have here.
Your trajectory and also what excites you. And I know that one of the questions that I'm really hoping that you can help our viewers understand is what exactly is the current process for the redevelopment planning? What timelines can Virgin Islanders expect to see the park plan for the redevelopment under? And can you speak specifically to the recent public comment period that the park held to receive feedback from the community, as well as can you tell us a little bit more about the environmental contaminants at Caneel?
So let me first start by referencing that the National Park Service does not have a particular desired outcome. I think one of the perceptions is that we already have something in mind that we want to do and we're aiming to kind of move on that. And that's not where we are. We have been engaged in having community dialogue to shape what we do in the future with our broader community. We want to continue that dialogue, not only with the broader community, but with our agency partners, territorial agency partners, federal partners, local organizations, the local business community, to have a real participatory approach to how we go about thinking about Caneel going forward. I think it's important to reach back just 18 months ago, or even just 12 months ago, before we had environmental results to share, before we went out and asked the public's initial ideas back last year in April and May, before we had a competitive bid process for us to think about, before we launched this effort, just considering the amount of impact our community engagement has had thus far in just the past 10 months alone. The comments that we received back last year in April and May really helped shape the types of alternatives that we've shared with the public. So we went out as Dr. Sewer referenced to the public in January to share 4 different alternatives going forward. One where there's no commercial activity on the site, and then 3 different commercial activities approaches where there's some variations in how commercial activity can commercial activity could happen. And these were shaped directly by a lot of the input that we received from the community back in April and May of last year. So some of our next steps are to move forward with sharing the environmental sampling results that we just recently took earlier this winter. Our goal is to share that with the public this summer. We want to describe what hazards there are with anything that we found, outline what type of mitigation or cleanup actions we could have with any of those contaminants. And then later in the fall, we want to release the environmental assessment, this kind of planning document that we're working on now, that will describe whether or not commercial activity is going to happen on the site, and to what degree, if commercial activity happens, to what degree it will happen. And the public will have an opportunity to comment on both those environmental sampling results and any cleanup plan associated with them, and also on the environmental assessment and that planning effort. So there's a lot of momentum that's building, and we want to be very thoughtful about the plan, but we also want to make sure that we have a plan in place by the time we're getting to the retained use estate ending September 2023. I think that's a real key point, is that just next year, we're looking at the retained use estate that's been in place for now 39 years, ending in the very last day of September of next year. And our best position is to continue to work with the community to have a plan in place at that time.
Thank you. Can you also help us to understand what we can expect to see in the crafting and rollout of the bid process moving forward?
I was hoping that Ms. Richardson would be able to be on, and maybe we could hear her, but generally speaking, once we have determined whether or not there will be commercial activity, if that is the direction we're going to go in, it's a matter of determining whether or not we have a concessions or a lease, or both, right? So if we have a lease, there is competitive process by which we follow the law that is outlined, and policies and practices that the National Park Service has on how we manage leases and go out with competitive bid. And similarly, when it comes to concessions opportunities, and with concessions, we have a lot more engagement with any concessionaire. There's a prospectus that we release as a part of our competitive process. And that allows anyone to apply that has the abilities to do any of the necessary and the appropriate things that we put into that concessions contract. We have a concessions that operates on St. John now, out at Trunk Bay and out at Cinnamon Bay. It provides for overnight experiences at Cinnamon and also day use experiences, food, beverage. We have the showers and so forth, all at Trunk. And so we want to figure out what types of things will be appropriate and what things may even be necessary at Caneel Bay going forward. And that way we can figure out whether or not we need a lease or a concessions or some combination. But part of it is this process of asking the public and hearing from them on what are the critical needs, what do we really want to see, what are the visitor uses, what are the environmental considerations we need to be mindful of, what cultural and natural resources we really want to protect, so that we can be mindful of all those things as we shape an opportunity for a commercial activity. If we go in that direction, that can be opened up for anyone to bid on. But if Ms. Richardson is here, I know she can also speak very briefly about how we run commercial operations within the Park Service.
Absolutely. Right now, we want concessions contract in the park, and that manages the lodging, the overnight accommodations, the camping, the water sports rentals, the retail food and beverage operations that is occurring between Cinnamon Bay and at Trunk Bay. And really, as we talk about leases and concessions contracts, I think we're not there as to determine whether it will be a lease or a concessions contract, but I could just kind of highlight some of the major differences between a lease and a concessions contract, because leases are usually for 10 years, but they can go up to 60 years, but they're not determined, or profit is not a determination when we're looking at a lease. When we're looking at a concessions contract, it must be viable, and we also have to do a financial viability to make sure that there is profit that's going back to the concessionaire, which is not the case with a lease. Also, the lease, um, we focus on outlining kind of prohibitive uses, things that are more like environmental damage. With a concessions contract, we have more control, more oversight. Like with, I could just reference St.JanCo Bay, we have to review their risk management and their emergency action plans, their environmental plans, their universal access plans, their inventory of hazardous substances, their inventory of waste streams, pesticide use. We review their employee handbooks, and then there's also the other contractual things that we oversee with them, which is like their facility improvement project, how much money is being spent there, their annual financial reports that they have to provide us. We have to work with them on their maintenance plans to determine the dollar amount that is being spent, and the deferred maintenance plans, as well as we have reimbursable agreements for water and wastewater services. So that's kind of a range of things that we manage under a concessions contract. With the lease, it would be less prescriptive, as far as management is concerned, but we would still have some things that are highlighted in the lease that are specific to that location. But definitely a concessions contract has more control and oversight by NPS as opposed to a lease. And I'll stop there.
A question that I have for both you and for Superintendent Fields is you mentioned the public comment period that took place and ended on March 4th. And one of the questions that I have is what opportunities exist for Virgin Islanders to provide feedback and input moving forward?
I'll be glad to start with that. So first, I want to give a heartfelt thank you to all who did submit comments and provided their thoughts. As you mentioned, Hadia, people have a lot of opinions, and it's been great to see the wide range of exciting ideas and suggestions that have come from all over the place, but a lot of folks from the Virgin Islands also providing input, and also the Virgin Islands diaspora. It was great to see folks that very much care about the Virgin Islands, who still have a lot of connection and deeply rooted in the Virgin Islands, also finding this opportunity to be able to voice their concerns, to participate in some of the virtual sessions, which is one of the benefits of a virtual session, although I know there's many downsides, but also being able to have them put in their public comments. This is a striking contrast to some of the other previous public engagement and public comment periods that the Park Service has had in the past. So when we opened up the public comment period from January 18th through March 4th, looking at these 4 different alternatives, we began to see the comments rolling in, and I think we had over 700 comments that have come in, and we're still getting a few that were postmarked that were mailed. So I know I had one that came in yesterday. So once again, really excited and pleasantly surprised that we've exceeded our expectations for getting people to engage with us on this topic. Next up, we aim to share just kind of a summary of those comments that we received. I'm hoping that we can get that out next month. And then, as I referenced during the summer, we'll go back to the environmental investigation and have public comment period on what we found. And then going into the fall, we're going to summarize everything that we've heard. We're going to demonstrate how we've analyzed several of the environmental factors and lay out back to the public again what we're looking at in terms of these alternatives. We were calling these 4 preliminary alternatives, so we now want to start moving and honing and refining these, and we'll get that out to the public later on this fall for the public to comment on. So much more ahead, and a lot more engagement is ahead, and I'm hoping that we just continue to see the engagement build over time.
Thank you. I also hope that we are able to see the engagement build over time, and I'm also hoping that there will be meaningful opportunities for Virgin Islanders, to continue to say what it is that we hope to see at Caneel. Senator Payne, you have made a concerted effort to be vocal about the Caneel Bay issue. You held a town hall in Cruz Bay. And Can you tell us a bit about why Caneel is an important political issue to you?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sura. First of all, I want to say thank you for hosting this platform. On behalf of the people of the territory that I represent, we want to say a resounding thank you. Now, first and foremost, I'm a lawmaker, and we're the people that govern by laws and policies. As it relates to laws, Title 16, U.S. Code, Section 398D, Section B, as it relates to employment and training of residents to develop the park. I want to read as to not paraphrase. The Secretary is authorized and directed to the maximum extent feasible to employ and train residents of the Virgin Islands to develop, maintain, and administer the Virgin Islands National Park. I want to read it one more time, Dr. Sewell. The Secretary of Interior is authorized and directed to the maximum extent feasible to employ and train residents of the Virgin Islands to do what? Develop, maintain, and administer the Virgin Islands National Park. Now, I want to take a minute to just talk about the word develop. The national park, in my opinion, has not followed the letter of the law as it relates to hiring and training residents to develop the national park. According to the law, the residents were supposed to be the ones developing, maintaining, and administering the national park and its properties in the Virgin Islands. And here we are now at a crossroad where the residents were supposed to be the individuals developing, maintaining, and administering the park are simply being given 4 options to vote from. Laws are simply rules by which we govern our society, and those rules provide us with a guideline as to what we can and cannot do as citizens. Now, the law was never adhered to as it should have been, and I believe moving forward that we should do everything in our power to ensure that the laws that were put in place by the federal government are actually adhered to. Now, we know that the national park cannot roll back the hands of time and do what it should have done initially. However, moving forward, as they begin to work towards utilizing the maximum extent feasible to hire and train residents, as an act of good faith, they should allow the residents to have an input into the future of the development of Caneel Bay. This can simply be done by having open discussions, receiving input from the residents, incorporate the input from the residents, and come up with a comprehensive plan and move forward with that plan. I believe in my heart, 100%, there are more than enough investors who would gladly move forward with a developmental plan that they know the residents are not in support of. I can't think of any investors or developers that would like to develop properties where the residents are actually in opposition. But keep in mind, the decisions that we make today is actually going to impact generations of St. Johnnians, either in a positive or negative way. And as a representative of the people, I'm here to ensure that the voices of the people are simply heard.
And also, I really appreciate your highlighting legal mandate for the park to hire Virgin Islanders to the greatest extent possible, in part because many of the contentious issues that have existed between the residents of St. John, especially the St. Johnian community and the park, have often included the critique that there were not enough Virgin Islanders who are hired in positions of leadership over the years in the National Park Service. And so I also understand Superintendent Fields to be clarifying that while the park asked the community to comment on 4 particular possible pathways forward, these were simply frameworks. And as a community, we did have the option of giving feedback that perhaps exceeded even the bounds of what was previously presented and described. And so in many ways, it sounds like there may be many opportunities for us to continue to one, critique areas where the park has not lived up to the legal mandate as well as our expectations, while also having greater possibilities of input that might allow us to chart pathways forward where Virgin Islanders, for example, are able to be hired to the greatest extent possible in the Virgin Islands National Park and by extension in Caneel Bay and other areas specifically. And so I want to pivot a second to Dr. Crystal Fort Wrangler.
Dr. Stewart, before you
Hello.
go to
Yes,
Dr.
I'm
Stewart,
listening.
if I can inject shortly, we recently sent a letter to the Secretary of Interior asking for an extension because as we traverse throughout the entire island community, asking residents if they had heard anything about the plans that the national park had put in place. And hardly anyone said, no one said, most of the person says no. As a matter of fact, we even came out with a survey and we asked 2 questions that we submitted to the residents. We had over a little more than 200 persons to respond. Have you seen or heard any information in regards to what the proposed redevelopment ideas are for Caneel Bay put up by the National Park Service? The answer yes or no or comments. Second was, do you have enough information to make an informed comment to the National Park Service? Yes or no or comment. 19% of the persons we surveyed said no. They said no. We met with the churches, we met with the pastors, asked the pastors, do your parishioners have any idea of what's going on? They said no, have no idea. So that's why we requested, that's why we put it in writing to the Secretary of Interior, asking for an extension. Give us at least 2 months or 3 months so we can traverse the community and get their input in the future of Caneel Bay. Is of a serious matter to the community, and we should not move forward with anything on another property without going through the community, using the different platforms that we have to disseminate information and get true public feedback from residents who reside here.
Superintendent Fields, would you like to comment at all on any of the challenges that the park may have faced in its ongoing outreach, or any of the plans that the park may have to expand its outreach in a way that might allow for the park to reach wider cross sections of the Virgin Islands community, especially engaging and focusing on the most vulnerable members of our community and or members of our community who may not find it easy to access some of the digital platforms where a great deal of the outreach and engagement has occurred.
Yes, thank you. So just touching back on something that was referenced as a challenge that you referenced, Dr. Sewer, was that at this point, we're at a level of very high and early engagement. And so the questions that we were posing to the public are largely about the landscape. What things should be on the landscape? How can the land be used? What kind of engagement, visitor services, whether there should be a hotel or not, what have you. We're looking at those questions and kind of where there should be. Should there be some kind of community space like a museum or amphitheater and so forth? And many of the comments that we got focused on those things and gave us great comments and thoughts on their opinions about the landscape. There were a lot of other comments, though, especially those from St. Jonians, those in St. Thomas, people that are directly connected to St. John as a part of the diaspora, that were focusing on hiring and the treatment of employees, being able to make sure that employees are being treated fairly and justly. And as the senator was just mentioning, also about a focus on local hires, having year-round operations and full-time jobs, whether or not there will be EDC tax benefits, and if so, if they are offered, under what conditions should they be offered, whether or not spaces within Caneel Bay in the future can be used for hurricane shelters, whether there should be vocational or culinary training kind of woven into the business practices. And these are all great ideas, and these are all things that are going to be very important potentially for any negotiations that we have in the future. So even though some of the comments that we received, as you mentioned, were maybe outside of the bounds of what we were initially asking, all of it matters, and we are making sure we're holding on to all those thoughts and ideas because we can activate them later in the process. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that the comments that they have provided are not in any way going to help us. I think it's a matter of when they're helping us in the process. So all of them we have, and we're grateful for them all. And we're also grateful for the places that we were invited into. Whenever we've been invited, just like this here, we go, we make sure someone can be there to give a sense of what we're doing and where we are. That was the case with the St. John Community Foundation last year, inviting us to a space to bring in and meet with a lot of the seniors in St. John, and also many of the former workers at Caneel Bay, and those that just have a very general interest in Caneel Bay, being able to engage with some of the ministers on St. John, and also with the churches, and being able to have the churches be a place that any member of the community that can get there will be able to have their thoughts transcribed and entered into the record. So I'm also appreciative to the senator and the senator staff for also helping to broker some of those relationships. We can do so much more together. Things like this, opportunities like being able to have this conversation through WTJX, through St.JanCo, reaching out to others through conversations makes the biggest difference. And so as we're invited to places, we're able to go and share where we are and invite people to comment and for us to document their comments. And then finally, I'll mention that during that last week of public comment period, we had what we called office hours. Anyone can come to the visitor center between 2 and 4 p.m. and have an engagement with the ranger, and also have their comments documented then. So we were trying to find ways to not have it only be about getting on the computer, but ways in which people can have conversation, to have their comments reflected back to them and have that as a part of the record. So we like to continue those types of activities as we roll out the next wave of public comment periods, to make sure the technology is not the barrier. We really want to make sure we have the conversations and get to the comments.
For that clarity, especially given the fact that I find that your remarks help to ease some of the anxieties that many members of the community may feel about whether the March 4th deadline was the last opportunity to actually engage. And so it's great to know that in many ways there are ongoing opportunities for providing feedback. With that being said, Dr. Crystal Fort Wrangler, I know a great deal of your filmmaking and your scholarship has focused on the ancestral community of St. John, and you've helped in many ways to illuminate some of the relationships that exist between Virgin Islanders and the Virgin Islands National Park. Can you tell me a bit more about your work and how it might help us to understand the issues at Caneel Bay?
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for this opportunity. So I think what might be the most effective right now, useful as my role as a scholar, someone who studied the history of this park and the interactions and the policies surrounding it, would be to, it feels like a train's moving forward with the Park Service and the conversation here that it's okay to still move forward. We've got through this March 4th deadline. There's plenty of opportunities, but I'd like to halt that for a minute and say that this whole process is problematic and needs to be, from my perspective, and I'll make the case for that, to step back. Senator Payne mentioned that there's, a request for an extension, provide more space. I think we can go even one step further and say that the preliminary alternatives that have been issued by the Park Service need to be reissued. And that's because there has been participation of St. Johnians, ancestral St. Johnians, Virgin Islanders, especially in the past few weeks. There's been a strong effort towards that, but it's the wrong place in the process. There's a very limited window of opportunity whereas these preliminary alternatives were created with input that was collected from last year, maybe some along the way. I can't speak to that exactly when they stopped taking input on creation for the preliminary alternatives. But when those are created, you get these 4 pathways. I think absolutely that we can show with data evidence that St. Johnnians and Virgin Islanders were not adequately, meaningfully engaged in that process in order for the Park Service to issue those 4 preliminary alternatives. And so the argument is that you need to step back. And I think even with the 1978 code that Senator Payne is mentioning, there's an argument here to say that Virgin Islanders should be hired, trained, et cetera. There's time. We have some time to work through this in a proper process. So hire Virgin Islanders to help create the preliminary alternatives as part of this process and ensure that St. Johnnian voices are a part of creating the preliminary alternatives. You can't send out 4 and get them into everyone's minds as to that's what we have as an idea and not have properly meaningfully engaged Virgin Islanders. And there's precedent for this. We can look easily back to other sites in the Park Service who have done this, but I would also add the Virgin Islands National Park has done a better job of this in the past. And to that, I would turn our attention to the general management process in 2004, a plan for the general management plan, which required an environmental assessment, the same exact thing we're going through now, in 2004 through to 2006. Now, just a quick note, I'm not saying that subsequently that turned out grand or that there's been great engagement with the Park Service and Virgin Islanders then or now, but the process to create the preliminary alternatives was different. And we see in that case a St. Johnnian hired as a consultant prior to the creation of the preliminary alternatives to ensure that St. Johnnians were at in-person meetings, specialty group meetings. This was under the leadership of Art Frederick, superintendent at that time, to make sure that you had a wide range of St. Johnnians at these meetings, giving ideas, engaged in person. And that's important. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute about that in-person engagement that the federal government should be doing. And made sure that you had this connection between St. Johnnians, and this is really the Department of Interior, right? We're at the Department of Interior level, but National Park Service is under that. And so there's precedent to do this differently, and we're assessing plenty of data and information for the Park Service and Department of Interior to take into account right now that they need to step this back. So a few months, 6 months, whatever it takes to do this right. So, Hadia, do I still have a minute just to mention this other reason? Are we okay on time?
You do.
Okay. So there's a problematic process that's happened. We know that until very recently, very few St. Johnnians were engaged in this process. So we know we need to fix that. So there's another argument here as to why this needs to happen. And this is called it's an executive order. It's 12898. It was issued by President Clinton in 1994. And it's called Federal Actions to Address EJ and Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. Just a quick note, environmental justice, if it's not a term that everyone's familiar with, it's essentially that everyone has the right and access to clean and healthy environments. But a second piece of that is that minority and low-income communities have access to public information and public participation in a meaningful way. That has not transpired at the moment it needed to in this process. And so that is not a law that has teeth, per se, this executive order, but it guides federal agencies and how they should be engaging minority communities, low-income communities. And at this point in time, it's worth mentioning that we have, fortunately in this case, a Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, and a new director of the National Park Service, Charles Chuck Sams III, who both have historical understanding of environmental justice and have advocated and argued for it in their public careers. I am enthusiastic and optimistic that those two positions together can help make sure that this situation on St. John steps back and follows an appropriate process focused on engaging St. Johnnians and Virgin Islanders in a meaningful process leading up to the creation of the preliminary alternatives, not after. That's all.
Thank you,
More
Dr.
later.
Foreigner. I actually have a question for both you and Superintendent Fields. To what extent is it possible to roll back the process? And if it is possible, what might that look like?
I'll start. This is Nigel Field. So we have a difference of our experience here because we have been very pleased with the engagement that we had from the St. Jonian Virgin Islander as well as the broader community back in April and May of last year, where we first asked the questions as to what types of things would people like to see, what is valuable and important to them on St. John, and then what would they envision going forward. And the things that we heard back from the broader community, especially those that were right here in St. John, is that people wanted greater access to the site. They wanted to make sure there were opportunities for local hiring and that there was better corporate stewardship with any type of commercial entity to really truly engage with the local community. There was a lot of focus on the historic structures and how we protect the stories that are told on St. John. The stabilizing the beach and the shorelines, protecting the marine life, focusing on environmental sustainability and resilience, being mindful of the realities of climate change, sea level rise, rising temperatures, energy systems that are mindful of energy usage that doesn't impact and contribute to greater environmental risks in the Virgin Islands, and of course the focus on being able to tell those critical stories like the revolt of 1733. So all those things are some of the things that shaped the way in which we took those public comments and built them into those alternatives. Another clear example is the community space. That does not exist right now on Caneel Bay. The idea of having a cultural museum or a amphitheater or some space like that. And with a willing partner, something like that could exist in the future. And that came directly from the voices in St. John saying that we need to have something like that here. These are conversations that existed before Caneel came open for public comment. So it was great to see those being conceptualized. People referenced the parking, that parking was going to be a major issue. So we found ways to make sure we could look at an alternative for parking. So all those things that went into those 4 alternatives have been informed by many of the voices that we heard from St. John. So we want to make sure that once again that we are thoughtful. At the same time, we want to have a plan in place before we get to September 2023. So we really want to encourage folks to continue to stay engaged, stay involved, and continue to build the number of people that are able to provide comment as we move forward with the next set of steps ahead of us.
Thank you.
And if there's time later, I would like to just reference one quick thing on environmental justice, but we can come back to that if there's time.
Mr. Roberts, you have such a robust history with working with the National Park Service, both in the Virgin Islands and in the United States. Can you tell us a bit about your career with the park and what your thoughts are on the redevelopment at Caneel?
Thank you very much. My career actually started with the Park Service about 1968. I was in the Park Service for 37 years. And one of the reasons I left the Virgin Islands is, I worked in Biscayne National Park, Cabrillo National Monument, and in Alaska. One of my reasons for leaving was because I was told by the National Park Service that I could not be promoted unless I had an outside experience. And so I left and I went on those assignments. And while I was on that, I applied to come back to St. John, and I was told that I was not a local hire, and therefore I could not compete for the position. So I didn't get it, and I retired. I was qualified to retire before that, but I would love the Park Service, and therefore I continue to work beyond my retirement point. I'm a little bit surprised because I knew that the Park Service would be getting possession of Caneel Bay in the year 2023. However, I was not aware that the process had started of establishing the criteria for the park, or for Caneel Bay joining the park. It's and one of the reasons is because I did not pay much attention to the media. I once I left the Park Service, I decided that it wasn't something that I really wanted to pursue, so I didn't, and maybe that was my fault. I should have paid more attention if I wanted, or I would have paid more attention if I wanted to be involved. But I didn't, and I met Nigel, and I had worked with Bob Stanton and some of the other previous administrators and the director of the Park Service, John Jarvis, and others during my time. So I had a real love for the National Park Service. And the interesting thing is that when I left high school, I went to work for Caneel Bay. I worked there for 1 year before going into the military. And at that time, I wasn't concerned that much about what was going on at Caneel Bay. I did, while I left and went to the military and came back home, I did programs at Caneel Bay, educational programs, because I was in interpretation, which was the educational branch of the Park Service. So I did programs at Caneel Bay. They had a theater where I would give programs at night, and then sometime in the daytime I give historic walks. So I was involved in the educational aspect of Caneel Bay back in those days. I can't hear you.
Story.
I think we've lost.
In part because often when I hear many St. Johnians, especially those who do a lot of advocacy work around the park, talk about the need for more local hires, they often speak somewhat sadly about your experience and the ways in which they hope that the park would have honored your experience and expertise more. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to hear a bit more about your trajectory. And Mr. Marsh, I do have a question for you also. As an architect and a fairs advocate for historical preservation, the arts, and also planning, can you tell us a bit more about what paths forward you hope to see at Caneel?
So who did you want to start?
Mr. Marsh.
Because you started with Uncle Edmund and then you pivoted to me. I thought he would respond first. No? Okay. So the Caneel Bay site is a critical site. I'm going to start from a sort of larger historic perspective and try to work my way down. But Caneel Bay is a really critical site. Beyond the Rockefeller narrative and beyond it being, a hotel development and the like, some of the most major events of the 1733 revolution took place on what was then the Durloo plantation that we now know as the Caneel Bay plantation. And so it has been a critical part of, St. Johnians knowing themselves. And this in this space for quite some time. And so if we move forward and we come, to the post-emancipation era, and we're getting into the development of this space as a park, we have this exercise by Rockefeller and others to, come into this space and sort of reestablish what we had known ancestrally, to feel like a plantocracy experience. And so, we know all the history of, the space being St. Jonians being displaced, or the major attempt to displace St. Jonians from this space and all of this. And so I say that to say there's been experiences, very many experiences over the years where there's always been sort of this tug of war between the people of this space and others that seek to develop that space. And so I think this moment, wearing my historian hat and my advocacy hat, this moment is important in terms of how we decide to change the narratives of these spaces and the relationships between the people of St. John and the outsiders, in this case, the park. This is an opportunity that we haven't had for some generations to try to turn the tide in how this happens. Now, the planner in me would love to see that process be much more grassroots and much more on the soil than I've been able to see to this point. And I think that's largely because of COVID and people not being able to really gather. But I want to make the case that, community engagement, whether it be charrettes, not handouts and posters and things like that, but community charrettes, people come to space and share space and move through ideas and solutions and proposals. But in a very grassroots context where we're going to churches and we're finding the people that can't come to a space. We're engaging the people of the diaspora using technology however we can. But most critically, the on-the-ground response, because there's been an overwhelming response, I'm sure, regarding what people want to see happen at that property. But, St. John has a very large a group of lovers beyond the shore. And so many times the people of this soil, the voice that is trying to come from this soil is drowned out by all of these other ideas and perspectives and influences. And so it's important that this very, very grassroots level engagement takes place. And you have create opportunities for, homegrown experts in architecture and planning and cultural engagement and the like, business. You invite those persons to the table so that we could lead the conversation, because it has to get past the point where we're just taking ideas and solutions from abroad and implementing them. But we have to get to a point where we are leading these conversations.
I deeply appreciate that commentary and feedback. In part, it also highlights for us just some of the ways in which our territorial status impacts our everyday life. And that has been a significant issue for us, namely recognizing that our voices are often drowned out and don't necessarily have the same level of volume as the voices of some of our visitors. And with that being said, I do also want to ask Mr. Roberts whether if you wanted to tell us a bit more about what pathways forward you hope to see.
Well, first of all, I would like for you to be able to recognize the differences between so-called St. Jonians, because anyone that comes to St. John, if they're here for a month, they may consider themselves as St. Jonians. The indigenous people doesn't step forward and speak up. I'm one of them. I stay in my little box and don't normally say much. And there are many of us, I think, like that. We do not take a step forward and speak up for ourselves. We try to avoid conflict. But you have people that move to St. John that is here for a month, and then they want to tell you how to live and how to interact with the land. I think Kurt was alluding to this. This is quite common, and I have experienced this. I don't challenge it, but it happens. I recall the plans for the for the wilderness area of the national park. And I was the only one that was indigenous that was sitting on that meeting. And they were about to establish a wilderness area in St. John. And St. John, the island isn't large enough for a wilderness area. So these things do happen. And I don't know how it can be changed. I think when some of the folks are working on their education, they came across this problem with identifying the people who are participating. And there's not much more that I want to say about it. I have opinions about a lot of things having to do with the national park, but I'm not sure, because I haven't thought them all out or discussed them with others, whether or not these ideas should come to the surface. I met with the director of the National Park Service and told him, for example, that they should not claim land before they check surveys and make sure that they do have deeds to the properties. This was never done, apparently, because they challenged my family after that and lost the case. So these things do happen. Thank you.
And some of the environmental justice issues that we see arising with Virgin Islanders' experiences with the Virgin Islands National Park. I understand that we have callers on the line who would like to join us and pose some questions, comments, or concerns. So, my mistake. I'd like to remind you that you are able to call in if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. And to do so, please call 340-718-3339. And to go back to the comments that you were noting earlier as it relates to environmental justice in particular, it becomes really important to recognize that this is such a pivotal moment in the history of St. John, that this opportunity for redevelopment also allows us to re-engage and reimagine what environmental justice means for St. John. We understand that the Virgin Islands is, of course, a U.S. colony, that the park is, of course, a federal entity, and that many of our challenges with the park are often exacerbated by our experiences with not being able to vote at the federal level, but also with long histories of anti-Blackness in the Caribbean and the wider Americas. And so this really gives us a moment in time to design a pathway forward that brings just options and futures onto the table. And so I would like to ask each of you whether you might be willing and able to comment on what a just future at Caneel, what that could possibly look like. And I'll actually start with Kurt.
Oh, was I muted?
Yes.
I apologize. I was saying that's a loaded question because the contemporary designer in me wants to fantasize about beautiful new architecture, unlike the likes of what we've seen in the territory. Grow from that space and be born there. But also, coming up deeply rooted as a St. Julian, and naturally, innately, we are great environmental stewards by way of indigenous practice and the likes. I do also, that part of me wants to see the space stay as preserved as possible. But I think there's a beautiful opportunity to have both of those things marry. And so as we think about, how we're redeveloping the space, we could have new architectural interventions there. Some of them that are new and very contemporary and very forward leaning, structures that generate conversations about sustainable practice in materiality, and long-term building health and longevity, things like that. While still, or we could talk about the restoration of the historic structures, and how we could seek to educate about that process and what the sustainability of that process may or may not have looked like. So there's all this really great opportunity for educational investment, as well as cultural engagement and historic narrative development. All these things that could happen architecturally, but it's all still tied into these ideas about what indigenous sustainable practice had looked like. So I think if there's an opportunity where St. Junians are leading the conversation about what should happen at that space by way of development, then we have an opportunity to right some of those wrongs that have occurred with environmental injustices and things like that, because it'd be a context where we're controlling what is happening in that space. And so we'd control what's happening in that space from that point of indigenous reference, rather than the very heavy-handed, aggressive response we've had, that affects our natural foodways by way of the coral reef monument and things like that. We don't have access to our waters and our lands the way we would indigenously to hunt. If you remember the time when we were denied access to hunting deer, and then the deer population got crazy, and then the park quelled the deer population, and now there's a whole permitting process and all these things. So all the layers of disenfranchisement that have occurred or existed to this point, there's an opportunity in this space to reimagine, as you stated earlier, what those engagements could look like between us and each other, between us and the land, and then between us and visitors. So fantastical spaces that we haven't seen, like amphitheaters and heritage museum, culture center. We could have spaces for visiting artists and studios and or traveling artists and things like that. Space for interpretation where we're doing archaeological digs and the like. There's opportunity that there may be a community pantry and a teaching kitchen. And so there is some sort of academia around, the culinary arts and things like that. We could have a fine arts program, at the university level. The Virgin Islands has no shortage of world-class artists and creatives. And so I could get really crazy as a contemporary designer about what could happen in that space and what I'd love to see happen. But I think the focus should definitely be on, this opportunity to do just what a lot of this conversation has been about, which is right environmental justice wrongs, while giving St. Julian's an opportunity to declare their path forward, which is not something we've experienced much in the past.
Thank you. And while our fellow panelists are getting their thoughts together, one of the things that I do want to say that it's always critically important to me to remember that Caneel Bay is a former plantation, and therefore it does raise a lot of questions for us about slavery and the aftermath of slavery. And one of those questions is who should profit from the remnants of the plantation system. And so as a predominantly Afro-Caribbean community, especially one that is a territory of the United States of America, I believe that Caneel Bay's redevelopment also brings up questions about just some of the injustices embedded in our EDC program, as well as just some of the ways in which our structures are organized to allow a great deal of the profit of our resources to flow back to the contiguous US rather than to circulate in the territory in a way that could deeply benefit our local coffers and therefore our communities. And so in that vein, I'm often curious about to what extent it is feasible for the Virgin Islands National Park to prioritize and or grant opportunities to Virgin Islanders, not only in crafting the bid, but also how can we design a bid process that allows the people of the Virgin Islands the greatest opportunity possible to bid on the Caneel Bay area. And so with that being said, I do want to invite, of course, Senator Stephen Payne to also tell us a bit about what pathways forward you hope to see at Caneel specifically. Please remember to unmute your mic.
I apologize. Thank you, Dr. Sewer. I want to speak about the development as it relates to justice-oriented. Most of my comments will always come full circle back to the people, as I am a representative of people. Okay? Along with being a former police sergeant, I was also a teacher and a musician. I played music at Caneel Bay for like about 20 years. I saw management change over the years. I also saw that local employees of color were mostly hired as maids, groundskeepers, laundry attendants, busboys, some waiters, some bartenders. However, as you went further up the ladder, you couldn't find people of color. Over 20 years, that has never changed. You know, too often, developers say we are providing jobs. However, the jobs that they provide are always menial and fall under the low end of the scale. The employers go as far as bringing in individuals, even when we have qualified persons living here who are unemployed. And like I said, this went on for 20 years that I played music at this hotel. I strongly believe persons should be hired and given the opportunity for upward mobility based on their qualifications. And if you are redeveloping, if you are in the process of redeveloping, then you should redevelop with a new entity that is open to fair and impartial treatment of every person, no matter the gender or race.
So, Fort Wrangler, did you want to provide some comments on environmental justice possibilities at Caneel, as well as what pathways forward you hope to see?
Yes, thank you. Thanks. So my focus again is on process, less what ancestral St. Johnians, Virgin Islanders, residents of the Virgin Islands might come up with for their ideas moving forward. And so first I would say that, again, there needs to be a step back to redevelop the preliminary alternatives. Superintendent Fields, I guess we do have a difference of understanding about what transpired, and I suppose everyone will have to bring their receipts and have a conversation with the Department of Interior at some point about that. So I would say, one, St. Johnians need to be hired to develop the preliminary alternatives, step back. At the very least, St. Johnians can be hired, Virgin Islanders can be hired to ensure that voices are truly meaningfully engaged as we move forward. In-person meetings, this past process, to the best of my knowledge, did not include in-person meetings. I'm happy to be corrected. Door-to-door engagement with communities who don't have access to social media or digital forums. A focus on helping people even understand the NEPA process, pre-NEPA process, the NEPA process, even what people are doing as a part of this. It's a almost it's elusive and somewhat inaccessible process for most people. So I think there needs to be a lot of education generally about what this is. There also need to be studies done in advance. There's a process going on right now for an environmental study there, but there should be an archaeological study. There should be an administrative history for the Virgin Islands National Park, which does not, to my knowledge, exist, as many parks have, which helps lay out the entire history of the park. You know, there are injustices that have occurred over the past, 60 plus years with the national park. And this is a moment, I think, Dr. Sewer, you were alluding to this, and maybe others as well. This isn't just about Caneel. So I feel like we need to contextualize this. This is about the Department of Interior. It's about the federal government in relationship to a territory, also known as a colony. The United Nations includes the Virgin Islands as part of its decolonization process. And there are big questions here. And I anticipate and hope that the Secretary of the Interior and the National Park Service director, understand what's at stake here, that it's not just about what happens at Caneel Bay, it's about an entire process of engagement with a marginalized and disenfranchised community for over 60 years. So that's where we are. This environmental justice question isn't just what exactly happens at Caneel, but what's this whole process around who and how Virgin Islanders are engaged and recognized as a critical part of this process. And there is no one that can show me data or evidence that suggests that that's happened to date. It's been 60 years. Thanks.
Superintendent Fields, would you like to make a note of what environmental justice futures you hope to see at Caneel?
Well, I first wanted to, if I can, touch back on a couple of the insights that we've heard. I wanted to first thank Mr. Roberts for his service and am still anxious to continue to learn from him and from many others who have spent not only their lives here in St. John, but those that have had a lot of interaction with the national park. And so their insights are incredibly helpful, but also, as Mr. Roberts was mentioning, how do we build better comfort, right? So where there's been those moments of disjuncture between the community and the park, how do we continue to build levels of comfort so people feel that they're being heard and that their voices are going to help contribute to the future, and that there's a real need for them to do so. I think, as Mr. Marsh mentioned, this is a critical moment, and that there's a real opportunity here to vision forward in some new ways. And yes, there's all sorts of thoughts that we can have and charrettes that we can design based upon particular kind of uses, museum spaces and so forth. And I think at this point, we're just at the early stage of, what is going to make sense on the site. And then from there, we can begin to bring out even more ideas. So I think it's a really exciting time, but I also feel that people really do get a sense of the urgency and why it's important for them to contribute now. And we're beginning to see and hear from a lot of folks about this. And that's really exciting to us. That's what we're hoping. In terms of shaping the narrative, I agree with Dr. Wrangler that this is not just about Caneel. Been able to have the pleasure of working with Dr. Sewer on a pretty ambitious project out at Annaberg, another part of the park, where the want to tell and bring people into that incredibly lovely space, but also for them to get the weight and the depth of what happened there, some of the pain that was exhibited on that site, but also the perseverance of the people. That resonates to this day. That brings us to this place where we can look at how we're going to tell the stories of places like Annaberg, of places like Caneel, so that visitors have a richer, deeper experience and really get a sense of what these places, what these structures that they're seeing, what they mean. They're not just photo ops that they're passing by. There's a lot of depth and a lot of ways for them to understand their place, for them to get a sense of the things that took place there and what it means today. When it comes to environmental justice, of course, I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, as I mentioned, for 15 years, and I had a focus on the science needs of environmental justice and promoting a more just and safe environment, particularly for minority and low-income populations that were negatively impacted by multiple environmental stressors. So this topic is very close to me for several reasons. And as our approach thus far when it comes to Caneel Bay, with identifying some of the contaminants that need to be cleaned up, we're aiming to do so to the maximum extent under our circular authority, under our Superfund authority. So those contaminants that fall within that authority, our goal is to reimagine a future of Caneel that is a clean future. So one of the things that's different in this approach right now is that our approach is to assume that we're going to move toward that clean future. So none of the alternatives, alternative A, B, or C, any of the options for the landscape, are showing any differences for future exposures. So any future worker, any occupational person, we're not looking at having any differential exposures based upon those alternatives. If there's ever a visitor, we're not looking at different levels of exposures based upon where they visit or how they visit on those alternatives. And similarly, in the future, if there's ever any residences there, we're not looking at any exposures that would then marginalize or further impact any particular residents in that space on those alternatives, A, B, C, or D. We're looking at making sure we're not transferring disadvantage to any particular employee, visitor, or residents in the future. So I appreciate the conversation, but I think there's a broader set of narratives that we want to continue to work with the public on shaping and work with the local community on shaping. And we also want to make sure we have a clean future for Caneel Bay going forward.
Thank you. And I'm curious about whether you're able to give us a bit of a sneak peek about some of the comments that you have received to date in the public comment period. I know that you noted that you will compile a summary and present that over the coming months, but have you received any feedback that you are willing and able to share with us?
What I can say is that it is a wide range, and I'm excited by that breadth. And also, what I've also been excited by is that there's not, no matter how you parse it, trying to say, well, what are Virgin Islanders thinking, or what are St. Jonians thinking, or what are visitors thinking, or what are we hearing from the business community? We're seeing a lot of variation across those alternatives, things that we have there, things that we don't have there, even within those subpopulations. So I think one of the things that seems to be really clear is if we're going to have commercial activity, there's some that really just want us to have the one, and there's others that really want us to have a variation, a range of things that are offered there. So again, we're just hearing a wide range of the responses, even within the various populations. So that's exciting to us, and we're glad to see that it's really healthy to have this conversation between St. Jonians and also with Virgin Islanders and those that are part of the diaspora. And I do think that continuing the conversations, especially if our churches continue to offer the opportunity to host us, like Calvary Baptist Church did, and like Bethany Moravian did, like the Lutheran Church has done, and the St. John Community Foundation also providing a space to meet with community members. As we're able to have these conversations one-on-one, we're going to continue to hear even that variation within the population, but also what are the key things that people really want. And that one of the things that we really heard a lot about is wanting to make sure people are treated well and that they are treated justly. No matter what happens on the site, they really want to make sure that people are treated fairly. And so we heard that. We heard some of the hurt and the concern that people have had in the past of how they felt they were treated and what their experiences were. And we heard some variation there too. We heard people that spoke very well about their history with Caneel. We wanted to respect that, but also respect the thoughts and the voices of those who felt that there had been some damage, and we don't want to repeat those things. So that's why we want to continue to hear from them and to make sure we're weaving in the best practices forward.
Thank you so much. I know that we are getting towards the end of our time together today, and I do want to reiterate my thanks to each of you for joining us. I know that we do have a question from a caller on the line about the amphitheater at Cinnamon Bay. And so if any of you are able to shed light on the amphitheater at Cinnamon Bay, please do so, while also telling us a bit about your closing remarks. And as a point of reference, I do hope that in wrapping up that you might tell us why you believe that the redevelopment planning at Caneel Bay, why Caneel Bay is important to us as a community, and how significant is this particular juncture in the planning process to our pathway forward.
Dr. Sue, I was wondering if Ms. Richardson is still here, if she can speak to the amphitheater at Caneel Bay and maybe give her wrap up, if she's still with us.
Unfortunately, I believe that we lost Ms. Richardson to connectivity issues. However, Dr. Fortwrangler, would you like to go first?
Sorry, I'm not able to speak to the amphitheater question, but I'm happy to, if you're asking for like final comments. Oh, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Before we go to final comments, I believe we do have a caller on the line. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. You are live.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I can't believe.
Good
Thank you.
afternoon.
I can't believe that in the year 2022, that the Virgin Islands National Park can't provide us with preliminary statistics as to the public comments, like exactly where the comments were, the number of comments that were coming from each state versus where they were coming from in the Virgin Islands. There were only, 4 options that we could choose. They should be able to tell us which option was the most popular option. I mean, good grief, this is available on Google Forms, and there should be more information than Mr. Nigel Fields is telling us right now. And I would like to know the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Superintendent Fields, are we able to get any preliminary statistics? If not today, included in the summary that you hope to publish in the next month or so?
So I'll see what statistics we're able to provide in the summary. Certainly, I can certainly give a sense that just me taking a look through the comments, I have seen things from many states, and I've seen a lot from folks right here in the territory and St. John. And those have referenced their longstanding connection to Caneel, some that have visited for many years, and also those that are from St. John that reference they really wanted to participate in the process and wanted to share their thoughts, even though they're living stateside. So we could look at the various states, but that doesn't necessarily always give us a sense of to how many folks are having, if you go the outside view versus those that are directly connected to St. John and wanting to participate from, say, Texas or from, say, Boston. And I was pleased to see so many Virgin Islanders, a part of the diaspora, feeling like they could participate in this process. So anyway, we'll have the summary. The goal is to get the summary out next month, and we'll kind of summarize the key things that we heard. The caller mentioned the 4 options, and we'll also provide a summary of some of the other things that were provided outside of those 4, right? So if somebody came up with a 5th idea, we may be able to give a summary of some of the things that were touched on in some of the ideas that came in.
Well, thank you so very much. And so I believe that we are at the end of our time together. And so I'd like to thank you for joining us. I believe this was an incredibly generative conversation about the future of Caneel Bay. Once again, I would like to say many thanks to WTJX, the Friends of the Virgin Islands National Park, and to each of our presenters for their work, advocacy, kind words, and insights. Superintendent Fields, it was really wonderful to have you provide some clarity on the ongoing redevelopment planning process. Dr. Fort Wrangler and Senator Payne, I deeply appreciate the attention that you gave to the law and also to the history of Virgin Islanders' relationship with the Virgin Islands National Park. I'm also very grateful for the insights of Mr. Kurt Marsh and also Mr. Edmund Roberts. It's always a privilege to be able to hear more about our public spaces, how we can meaningfully engage and reimagine them. But also, Mr. Roberts told us a great deal about his own trajectory with the National Park in ways that really inform how we might move forward. And so, whenever and wherever possible, this site is super important to us in many ways. And so let's reimagine the future of Caneel together and advocate for the creation and maintenance of public spaces Thank you. Have a wonderful day and take care.